Hi everyone. In this video we're going to talk about adding the finishing touches to a pattern that has been drafted in PatternMaker Pro. And if you haven't heard of PatternMaker Pro, it's specialized software that allows you to draft sewing patterns. And you can use the software to create patterns that you sell or share. And you can also make garments from your patterns to give to friends or family, or even to sell if you like. You have complete creative freedom and full ownership of everything you create in the program. So you can do whatever you want with them privately or commercially. And drafting your own sewing patterns with PatternMaker Pro gives you a unique opportunity to create patterns that are extremely user-friendly, whether that user is you or someone else. And if you're the only one that sews from your patterns, a little time spent at the finalizing stage with marking will save you tons of time when you go to construct the patterns. If you're selling or sharing your patterns, there are many types of people who sew, and some are ready to sew their very first garment. Some have been sewing for a very long time. And you can cater to those specific groups by making your patterns comply with their skills and their needs. So here is the PatternMaker Pro website if you want to follow along. There's a demo. It's full featured. You can do everything but print. So you can follow everything I do in this video. You have the option of actually creating these patterns in the program using a tutorial. There's a video on that if you want. It's a quick start. If you don't want to draft and you want to kind of cheat, you can go ahead and download the SVG and load it into the program and start basically where I'm starting. The pattern that I'm going to be working with is this 001, which is a real simple draft. Here's the draft we're going to be working with. And my first recommendation, when you get to this point of your pattern, you've got everything drafted, you have everything set the way you want, go ahead and do the file copy draft and save it out at this state. You'll typically want a really clean pattern just for later. In this case, this has been memorized, so this is a great endpoint on a recall. The process of adding all of these pattern markings can be somewhat unique to each individual pattern set, so I would suggest that you go ahead and save out if you're going to be memorizing. Sometimes you can have strange things happen on a recall with all this final markup. So this is my recommendation. If you have no idea what I'm talking about as far as memorization, again, there's a video on that. And basically, PatternMaker Pro allows you to record the steps that you've taken when you do a draft, and then you can recall it using a different set of measurements. So you don't have to redraft stuff. It makes quick work of it. So let's get to work on this sleeve pattern first. And you can see that it's a half sleeve pattern. It is symmetrical, so that means the front and the back of the sleeve are the same. But I don't want to cut a sleeve on a fold. I'd rather have this pattern all the way open. So we can come up here to the main menu and we're going to go under the layers. And then we have an option here to unfold the layer. Now you want to make sure that what you're unfolding is all on the same layer. In this case, it's my outline. That is the curve and lines that make up this outline of the sleeve. So I need to select 2 points that will work as the axis to unfold over. And I'm going to select the cap center and then the wrist and continue. And there my pattern has been unfolded. The solid line that was down the edge has now been turned into a gray dashed line. And I can get rid of that or leave it, whatever I choose. We're going to actually take advantage of it a little bit later. So I'll save that. Now, there are a number of considerations that you'll have when you go to finalize a pattern, and one of them is hems. And I would like to put a hem on this pattern. If you're going to be just turning up a seam allowance and not having an actual hem, then you wouldn't need to do this. To use the hem tool, I know that I need to have one solid line or curve to designate as the turning line, if you will. Now, because I unfolded this pattern, I have 2 lines here, and that will not work. So I'm going to come up here to the lines menu and delete lines and curves. I'm going to get rid of these. And now I'll just go up to the add a line and go from side to side and create one. And I can call this hem. So now it's done. And we can go ahead and open up the hem tool. That's up here in the process menu, and it's this little guy right here, add hem. So it wants me to select the edge or line or curve, that's this, and the sides. And the sides are required, and you'll see why here in a second. Now it has two options here. It has the hem depth and the raw edge turn. So the hem depth is how much of this I want to turn up, and then the raw edge turn is basically like the seam allowance on the edge. So if I just wanted a raw edge here, and then I was just going to turn it up, then I could just not add a value on here, and it would just be the width of the hem. But in my case, I want a little extra, so I can turn it over and then fold it up. So I'm going to put an inch on the hem, which is about 25 millimeters, and then I want to do a 1/4 inch to turn over first. So that's 0.25 inches, which is about 6.35 millimeters. And continue. So the hem is complete. You can see I have a dashed red turn line here. And you can't see that initial turn raw edge on the raw edge because it's a seam allowance value, and you will see that later when we put the seam allowance on the pattern. It'll do it automatically. So that's complete. Now typically when you're working through these finalization processes, you'll want to make sure you're on the correct layer for the final markings, because those will be on your output. And then all this draft geometry you would want on a different layer. I'm not going to do a bunch of switching here because it's annoying to watch, but just be aware of it, that you'll want to segregate what stays for final printing and what gets hidden as draft geometry, if you will. But one interesting item when you're working with sleeves and armholes is that you need to know what the difference is between the two in measurements. And that difference is called the ease, the sleeve ease. Typically, your sleeve will be the same or slightly larger than your armhole, and then you will just use gathers or just ease it in as you're sewing. That's such an important distinction that I actually created a tool so you can figure it out really quickly. So we'll go back up here to the final menu, and it's this item right here, which is Mark Sleeve Ease. So I'm going to zoom up just a little bit here and select the tool. So it says to select one or more lines that make up the front armhole. This pattern, the front and the back armhole are the same curve, so you can see the real distinction here is in the neckline. So my front armhole is this curve right here. And now it says to select the back armhole. In this case, it's the same curve. And now we're supposed to select one or more lines or curves that make up the sleeve cap. And if this was still half a pattern, I could select this and then select the box half of sleeve cap selected, multiply by 2. In this case, I have the full one, so I'll select both sides, and then I can ignore that. And here are my final measurements. My front armhole is 10.3 inches. My back is the same. My sleeve cap is 18.69 inches, and this is very bad. You don't want this. This is negative ease. That means that my sleeve cap is actually smaller than my armholes. And when this first happened after the draft, I thought I had made a mistake. And I went back to the drafting instructions, the book that I got them from, and I used her measurements that she was using in the book. And this wasn't the case. So this is another reason why you need to be critical of these types of measurements, because it varies. When you are using real people, this can happen. And this is one of my biggest pet peeves with drafting books. So many of them, particularly, I have one in mind in particular, is used in a lot of colleges. It's on like its fifth or sixth edition. I don't know. I've used this book for a number of years. It's got great content, but she is using standardized sizing tables. And lo and behold, everything in the book drafts really great when you use those standard sizes. You start using real people and things go haywire in a hot minute. So know that this is a possibility. And there are a number of fixes that you can incorporate to fix your patterns. So this is 2 inches. That's a lot. There are ways to fix this. I'm not going to go into that here, but this is super important to know because you need to fix that. That's bad. But we're going to pretend like it's not bad and just keep going. So it says to select anywhere on the pattern to place the information because I can see it here, but it would be nice to have this somewhere for reference. So I'm going to just slap it right there and continue. And it's created a little note for me. It says all that same information here. Now, it's important to understand that if you're working in some other unit, this will all be in your unit. If you're doing centimeters or millimeters, these values will be shown in something you're more comfortable with. I'm using inches simply because I think my audience is a lot US based, and I will try to convince you US people to switch to metric. It is so much easier. I use metric when I'm doing my own work, but I'm catering, so we'll continue on in inches. So the next thing we need to do is throw some notches on our pattern so that when this sleeve is sewn to the armhole, it matches up the way that it should. So the first thing I want to do here is these labels are kind of annoying during this process. So I'm going to come up to the utilities and I'm going to toggle those off. It's just easier to select stuff. So the first thing that might be kind of cool is if we take our center point of the sleeve and our center up here at the shoulder and mark those so that the person who's constructing the pattern knows that those two things should line up. So we can come up here and select change style color. Select the items to change. I want to change this guy that I can't select and the shoulder. And I'm just going to pick like a blue outline. That looks cool. So those match up. Let's save that. And now I want to add notches. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this process. Notches on the front are typically single notches. Notches that designate to the back are double notches. And this helps people to get patterns in the correct orientation when they're going to pin them and sew them. And in this case, our armholes are the same and our cap sides are the same, but we're going to proceed as though they're not. So you get a better idea how this should go. Now, the idea with notches on sleeve caps is that when you are sewing in the armpit, you do not want any of that excess ease, or if this was a big bishop sleeve or something that had a lot of gathers, you don't want gathers in the armpit ever. So that's what these notches typically do, is it designates from here to the armpit, sew it straight to this. And then if you've got gathering, do it between the notches. So that's what we're designating. Now, where these notches are supposed to be, everybody has an opinion on this one. So I've got references that they should be halfway between the bicep and the cap. Another that says it's 1/4 the distance between the bicep and cap plus a 1/2 inch. Still another says that it should be 6 inches from the side seam or the armpit here. So I don't know. You decide what works with your design and do it accordingly. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and just do the halfway because I think it's easier. So we'll come up here again to the finish menu and select notch. So this curve is what I'm notching. My distance by default will be halfway up the curve. So I'm just going to leave it right where it is, but you could change that value here. And then if you change the value, it wants to know which end are you measuring from. Are you going to measure from the bicep, or you're going to measure from the curve, so, or the cap, excuse me. So you make that distinction. And then what type of notch you want. So I'm going to preview that. And there's my notch, and that's how it should look. Now, something that it's doing that you really don't know, because you can't see that seam allowance, but it knows that the seam allowance on this curve has been set to a 1/2 inch, which is my system default that I set up. So when it drew the notch, it made sure it was a 1/2 inch long, so it will sit on that seam allowance line when we add that later. If you are doing notches somewhere else and you want them some different size for some reason, go ahead, change it. You can do whatever you like here. So since I have color options with PatternMaker Pro notches, I'm going to make my front notches pink. I don't know where I picked that up. I've been doing it for years, so pink for the front. And I just realized I don't want it halfway up the curve. That was a bad choice. I'm going to just change it over to 4 inches. And the reason why is I have to duplicate this on the armhole. So we'll do 4 inches. And I want it 4 inches from the bicep. So I need to switch that too. So that looks about right. We're going to sew this straight, and then any ease would be up here. Okay, we'll save this guy. And now we're going to make another one over here. 4 inches from the bicep. It's a double notch. Let's take a look at that. It's on the wrong side. There. And I do these in purple. So there's my front and my back notch. Now I would put those on my front and back bodice, again measuring 4 inches from the armpit so they would line up. I'm not going to do that right now, but just so you know, that's what you would want to do next. So the next thing we need to address are these long edges. I'm sure you've noticed in patterns that you've purchased in the past that you get designations on really long ones, so when you're pinning you can match them up side to side. So in this case, if we're pinning our underarm seam, it would be really cool if we had markers that we could match up so we were more confident. Now you can use notches if that's your thing. I have another system in here I think that's a little more intuitive, and it's these little markers up here, alignment marks. Here's where things get interesting when you're doing your own patterns and trying to make things easy for your users. In this case, for this particular pattern, I would recommend that the sleeve is pinned to the armhole and sewn, and then the edges are matched up, and it is sewn from the side hip up the side seam and down the underarm. So instead of turning the sleeve into a tube and then sewing up the bodice into a tube and then matching them and sewing it together, for this type of pattern I would just recommend that the sleeve is sewn into the armhole and then the entire side is sewn as one piece. So to facilitate that and make that more understandable for someone who might be less experienced, I can give indicators. So what I'm going to do first on these add alignment marks, I'm going to select the side seam on the bodice. I want to start at the side hip down here. And you can see if I mouse over how it highlights. There's little helpers in the program like this all over the place. So side hip, I think 5 inches is good. And I can preview that. And so here are my markers. And I have more options. Of course I do. I like numbers, so I'm going to start with the number 1 and preview that. So now I have 1, 2, and 3, and I don't like black, so I'm going to go with a dark blue. So now I have 1, 2, and 3, which gives the person who's sewing this an idea of the order, if you will. So I'm suggesting start at the bottom and sew up. So I'm going to save that. And now I'm going to move over to my sleeve. I want to start at the bicep in this case. I'm going to use the 5 inches again, and this time I'm going to start with number 4. And I want the same color. So now 4, 5, and 6. This makes it pretty clear to somebody that, oh wow, there's an order going on here, and that's true, that's how it's going to work. It would be nice, we need this on the other side as well, so I'm going to save this, come back up, starting at the bicep, 5 inches, starting with 4 in dark blue. Preview. So those now match up side to side. When the person is cutting out the pattern, they would go ahead and put little snips at these marks. And then when you folded the sleeve over, those two would match up. And then of course the bodice matches up to itself. And the numbers indicate, oh, look, these are in order. So that is a suggestion that that's what I intend how the sewing would go. Let's add some grain lines next, and that's up here, add grain line. And I have a number of options. I can create a perfectly horizontal one, a vertical one, one on the bias, or I can convert an existing line. I have this nice little dashed line right here. I'm going to take advantage of that. So convert existing line and select it. And there it is. I have a nice grain line. It's marked grain line in a dark green, which is pretty standard for pattern notations in the program. So I'll save that. The next thing that we should probably add is a label to our pattern to tell the person what the pattern is, how they should cut it out. That's up here with just text at point. I'll select, oh, let's put it over here. And now I need to say how wide I want this text to be. You can enter different values to change the formatting. I'm just going to put 4 inches. I think that's a good starting place. It's about 100 millimeters. And then for the text, what do I want to say? Well, this is a sleeve pattern. If you want to create a hardline return, which is like if you hit enter on your keyboard, you need to put a symbol of a /n. So I'm going to put that here, and you'll see that how that looks in a sec here. And then what do I want to do? This is Susan. That's always a good idea to put in whose measurements were used when the pattern was drafted. It was drafted on October 1st. And for cutting instructions, I want to put cut 1, flip, cut 1. Now this is a symmetrical pattern. It wouldn't be necessary to flip it, but I think that that's helpful for people to understand that typically you want to reverse. It's just a good habit to get into because you never know if a curve is different front to back. So I'm just going on the safe side. Now the other thing I think would be really important to add to this is the ease that was added during the draft. If you recall the memorization, typically when I do block patterns, I don't have any ease in them. And those are the slopers that you might fit for to confirm that the measurements are correct for an individual. But when you're doing patterns to sew that have design ease or wearing ease or a lot of changes, a lot of design changes, it's not a bad idea to make those notations because how would you know the difference? If you printed this pattern and one had ease and one didn't, you wouldn't really know by looking at it. So this is a good place to put that information. So in this case, I would want to put in if I had bicep ease or wrist ease. This I don't think has any ease. I think this is just my straight sloper. So I'm going to say bicep ease. How about no bicep ease and no wrist ease. Preview that. This is how it looks. And I have a number of options here. I can rotate it if I want. And this is if you're adding text on a curve or something and you want it to line up a little nicer. I can also change the font size to anything I want, which that's ridiculous. I think 5 was perfectly fine. And then I can choose the alignment of the text. Right now it's all aligned to the left. I can choose to align it in the center, and I can choose for the right. So you need to decide based on where you're placing this text, which is what is most readable for your user. And of course I can change the color. So we can change it to something else. That's a little bit lighter than you would typically want for that information. Let's go with dark green. So there's my pattern label, if you will. So I think we'll go ahead and add a seam allowance to this sleeve. It's pretty marked up the way I like it. Seam allowances are something that you should designate when you first start a draft. So I'll open this up so you can see that in the beginning I said I wanted all my seam allowances to be a 1/2 inch. So everything that I drew has a 1/2 inch on it automatically. The general value is what is applied. It doesn't know a neckline from an armhole. This is just for your own information. If you start a design and you decide, I want my necklines and armholes to be 1/4 inch, you just put that value in here. And then when you go in, you can change to what you've designated very quickly, and you don't have to remember. That's kind of the key thing here. So let me show you. If I decided, oh, I want this curve set to something different, I can select it. And now you can see that those defaults come up. So if I had set these to 0.25, I could just quickly pick it. So that's all that does. Just understand that your general default is what will be applied to everything that you draw. So I have a 1/2 inch on everything. And in order to apply a seam allowance, you have to be able to select the complete solid outline with no gaps. And I will make a mistake so you can see what happens. So select lines and curves, creating a closed shape. I'll select everything around here. I'm going to skip this little line here and just do this one and continue. And you can see it's found it and said, uh-oh, there's a problem. You've got these 2 blue lines, and it actually shows you the endpoints where the gap is so that you could make that correction. And I can go ahead and just reset, and now I have the opportunity to go ahead and select the correct outline. I'll pick those items again without skipping anything. I don't have to pick an order. I can pick any order I want. And now you can see that I didn't skip anything. Now, sometimes when you make a selection, you will think, it's closed, I can see this. But if you have created a point right on top of another one and used it for one line and the other point for another line, it may appear that it's closed, but this will always catch it if it's not. So always trust what it tells you and go back and make any fixes that you need to. So I'll continue. And there's my seam allowance automatically added. By default, it's going to be a dark blue. That's what I typically use, but you can change it to whatever you like. Sometimes when you do a seam allowance, it will draw to the inside of the pattern and just use other side to get it where it should be. I'm going to save that, and you can see that our notches are perfectly aligned seam allowance to sew line. And then down here, we changed our turn, our raw edge turn, to 1/4 inch. So even though the seam allowance is a 1/2 inch everywhere else, it's set to a 1/4 inch down here. If we had left it to raw edge 0, there would be no seam allowance. The blue line would be sitting right on the sew line. Let me show you a couple things over here on the bodice just to show you how the tools work. Now when we added the label to the other pattern, we used the text at point tool, which just allows us to put text that's perfectly horizontal. There are times when you don't want to do that, when you want your text aligned to something that isn't horizontal or vertical. So you'll go up here and select the 2 points that you're placing the text between. Again, it automatically did the math. It said these 2 points are about 3.5 inches apart. You can change that. I'm just going to put some text in and preview it. And it looked at the line that was selected and it put the text above it. I can use other side, so now it's below. I have all the alignment options. I have color options and font size. And it also will respect the hard return. So there's more text. So that's how the text between points works. And if you find that your text is too wide because there are curves or something, just change the width and it'll get a little bit narrower and fit in there. So I'm not going to save that. The next thing I'd like to show you is if you're instructing someone to cut on a fold. And that is up here, add cut on fold. And we've got our bodice front and back here, and I think those could be cut on the fold. It's just a t-shirt. So select the line, and there is the symbol, and it's on the wrong side. So it just creates the line with the arrows and says place on fold. We will keep that one. So that gives you a general idea of some of the items that are available for finalizing your patterns. I wanted to give you an idea of how far you could take this. I don't think I've ever seen a pattern that's done like this before, but when I was first starting, if I had seen something like this, I would have been very grateful because I didn't really understand things very well. So what I've done here is added not only a bunch of color coding. You can see that these notches are here. Again, I've got my front and my back on top of each other. That's why it looks like that. Let's look at the items that I added. We'll go through one at a time. And this is giving the person instructions on not only how to cut it out, but how to sew it. I used these add direction marks here. And I've indicated for step 1 is stay stitching to sew from the neck edge to the center following the arrows. It's an 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters outside the sewing line, which is always the black line, towards the seam allowance, on the front neckline on both sides, and then repeat for the back neckline. So I'm telling them I want some stay stitching that goes like this, and then you're going to do it on the other side over here so they meet in the center. And do it again for the back. Now this is a t-shirt and you would not put stay stitching on a t-shirt typically, but I just wanted to illustrate what you could do here. So step 2, the shoulder seam. Ignore the cut edges of the pattern and align the pattern pieces using the dashed blue sewing line. Pin and sew, repeat for the other side. If you cut this out and then you use those cut lines, which here is the blue, the seam allowance, and you try to align it, weird stuff happens and you get weird overlaps. Now this is super confusing to people who are new to sewing. So this really illustrates exactly what it would look like. So they would think, well, am I supposed to scooch this over so that this point aligns with this? Some people would do that, and then they would have a really bad looking neckline here. So you're telling them very specifically, ignore all of that, transfer this blue line, the dashed line, and then when you go to align it, align that. And these are the types of things you can add to your patterns that will really put them way ahead of anything else in the marketplace. For step 3, we're ease basting, and we're pretending like our sleeve is bigger than our armhole, which it isn't, but sew 2 rows of basting stitches following the aqua lines at 1/8 or 3 millimeter distance. They're shown right there. Step 4, attach the sleeve to the top, pin the sleeve to the armhole with right sides together, match up the notches on the sleeve cap to the front and back. That's our pink and purple. Match up center cap point to shoulder. That's our outline. Ease in the fullness on the sleeve between the notches using the basting in step 3 and sew the sleeve. Repeat for the other side. Now we've got step 5. Align the front and back and sleeve underarm at the side seam with the right sides together, match the numbered notches and pin, sew the seam. Repeat for the other side. And you can see here I've used a slightly different color blue, but I've got my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and matching on the other side. So now step 6. Finish the raw edge of the top hem, turn hem to the inside along the red dashed line, and sew hem in place. So in this case, I did not choose to put any kind of a turn on this. I just instructed them to finish the raw edge, zigzag or serge, whichever, and then to turn it. Now we'll step 7, sleeve hem, turn under edge 1/4 or 13 millimeters, fold hem up on the red dashed line, which is 1 inch or 25 millimeters, and sew hem in place. So here's the raw edge turn and then the turn up. And that is that. That is all the instructions to sew this together, short of a neckline. You can see that I've added the pattern labels. You can see them both. I've got nothing hidden. All the layers are here. Obviously, you would hide the sleeve in the back and print the front and so on. Now, one thing I wanted to show you that I think is kind of fun. We've got a t-shirt here, and I created a tool for creating bindings and t-shirts. Well, I have a t-shirt on. It's just a little cheap thing here, but this ribbing that you put either on collars or cuffs for t-shirts, it's very common, and it's nice to be able to generate that pattern simply. So I created a tool for it. So let's do that as our last little thing here. Obviously, I don't have instructions for sewing it on. That's another instruction. So we'll come up here, and that is in the process menu, and it's right here. It's called Add Binding. So it says to select one or more lines or curves to measure, because we're trying to figure out how long this binding piece needs to be. And we'll add a multiplier if the item is less than the full length. You can add more lines and curves with different multipliers, as you proceed. So I'm making a binding for my neckline. So I'm going to select the front neckline, and you're always selecting your sew lines. Remember that. Don't be selecting seam allowances. So I have this in 2 pieces because I reformatted this dashed line for the sewing instructions. So this is my front neckline, and it's only half. Obviously, when it's cut on the fold, there'll be another half. So I have a multiplier of 2 and measure. So it took neckline front 0, that's the name of this line. If I mouse over, you can see it, by 2, and neckline 1 by 2. So now it says to select more items and to measure, I need my back neckline. So neckline back, again, 2 times. This is only half. Measure, and now all of them are listed here. This total measurement is my complete neckline. So I'm done. So how wide do you want your finished binding to be? I'm going to do 3/4 of an inch. Now remember that this is just the finished width. This is not seam allowance. This is not the fold. You don't need to worry about any of that. What do you want as the final finished width? And I'm going to say 0.75 inches. Now it wants to know what is the seam allowance for the edge joined to the lines and curves selected. And it's 1/2 inch. I've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, and this would have been a great place to reduce this to like a 1/4 inch, but it is a 1/2 inch. So I'm going to leave the seam allowance at a 1/2 inch so they match up. And then it asks, what is the percentage of edge length? Knit rib binding may be as little as 66% of the binding edge length, whereas woven binding will be 100%. When you attach knitted binding, you stretch it as you attach it so it will lay flat and not stick up. So you'll want your binding to be smaller than your edge. So you get to decide based on how stretchy your binding is or your ribbing. I'm going to just throw 80% in here and then continue. So now it asks, where do you want this pattern at? And I'm just going to put it right here. And there is my pattern. I need to throw a label on it. In this case, I probably should put some instructions on it, but that is the entire pattern piece that I would need to add binding to this neckline. And again, all of the seam allowances have been set for me. If I can find the right tool, and I can finish this off very quickly. There's the binding for the neckline. You'll also notice that I have a waistband in here, which makes quick work of doing any type of a topper on a pair of pants. It's got overlaps, underlaps, all the goodies that you need, and it's this quick. These patterns can be time consuming and you're doing a lot of measuring, and so that's why I created tools that just do it instantly, basically, to save you some time. If you're a teacher and you're teaching people how to sew, you can see that there are so many things you could do with these patterns to help facilitate greater understanding of the sewing process. And custom marking patterns specifically for classes works well in the real world and for online tutorials, and take advantage of what PatternMaker Pro can do. You may get it in your head that you need to output patterns for people that look like purchased. I think the fault in that is the same as this mindset that we have that the clothes we sew need to look like we bought them. The reality is, no, you don't, and what you buy is not quality, particularly now. So you can do better, and you can get a reputation for providing patterns that are really useful for people, because the more successful they are when they sew your patterns, they're going to come back. If they had fun and it fit really well and they weren't confused, they won't hesitate to buy from you again. So what do you think of this? You're going to have to let me know down in the comments. What would you do if you bought a pattern and it had instructions on it like this and it was really explicit? Would you think that was just way too weird, or would you think, oh my gosh, this is super helpful, and be excited about buying from people who provided this information? What other stuff could I've added to this to make this simpler? Please let me know. It matters. When I was making this video initially and figuring out what I would have to do to finalize this pattern, this neckline occurred to me, and it's like, I hate drafting these stupid rectangles for figuring out how much the ribbing needs to be, how big it needs to be, because you got to do the fold and then the seam. And I thought, I'm going to make a tool. And that's what I did. And then after I got done with that one, then I did the waistband one. So let me know what's missing. What would you like to see? What would make this better? Because I am the one that's programming this. So if you can think of it, I can probably create it. And together we'll create something that's really fantastic for the marketplace. So I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.